Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show, talking today about historic houses. I'm going to tell you a story today about how an historic neighborhood got developed here in Fort Worth, the history behind it. 3 things you need to remember when you think about restoring your house that will make your house more valuable and better. Come check it out today on The Build Show. Fairmount. It's here in Fort Worth, largest bungalow district that grew up during an important time in the kind of growth of Fort Worth. Fort Worth is a frontier town. It's called Fort Worth, right? It was a fort. It goes back to the mid 1800s when you have these early forts, these frontier posts that would have kind of set the boundary for the western expansion across the country. Anyway, Texas is growing. Remember, the Alamo is 1836. We become a state in 1845, but really, you don't really see a lot of development, especially in as far north as we are and going west until 1870s, 1880s, right? And so we're still growing up at this time. Come 1900, Texas and Fort Worth is known for cattle and the cattle drives. And when the railroads come here in the 1870s and 80s, Fort Worth becomes a huge cattle yard called Cowtown for a reason, right? And they were shipping cattle from here going all the way up to Kansas City and further north. The big slaughterhouses and things, Swift and Armour, were up in Chicago, okay? They came down and built huge factories and slaughterhouses just because there was so much beef here. It was a gathering center. Down a little farther south of here, early 1900s, Spindletop happens, right? That is the discovery of oil in Texas. And so the oil boom starts in Texas into the 1920s and 1930s. It's a fascinating time. There's a great book called The Big Rich. It's all about the big oil families that made it in Texas. There's a family, Sid Richardson, the Bass brothers were the beneficiary of Sid Richardson's fortune. But Sid Richardson there's a great story, a little sideline here. He was filthy rich, early 1900s, 1920s. He loses everything, right? And so there's a pharmacy over here on the south side of Fort Worth. He would go and he would pay the pharmacy to answer the phone, Sid Richardson's office, right? When he made it big again, and he did it out in the oil fields in West Texas, he went back and he bought the pharmacy for that guy because that guy had taken care of him so long ago. So, but there's great stories of immense wealth and things that happened in Fort Worth in the 1920s. The reason I say all of that is because that's why we have Fairmount. Fairmount was a working man's neighborhood, okay? There's working man's houses. They were simple. They were inexpensive. They were not very big, 12, 14, 1,800 square feet, mostly wood-sided house. A few of them are brick, right? And so immense architectural character. And that period of time, the early 1900s into the 1920s, is a great period of the arts and crafts revival and the arts and crafts movement. So you see those front porches, you see those heavy columns, the tapered columns, all those famous things as part of that arts and crafts era is seen there. Now, tell you all that because if you own an historic house, I served on the Landmarks Commission when I got back to Fort Worth 20 years ago. The Landmarks Commission is basically, you'll have them in a lot of cities where we were appointed by our city council person to sit on the Landmarks Commission, and people would bring you their houses and they would ask if they could do certain things. Windows was a big one, right? I got to change my windows. I can't tell you how many times they would come in, they had changed their windows and they had to go back, but they had been swindled and boondoggled by, some kind of window salesman who said it's going to save you so much money, it's going to do all this stuff. No, it was a lie, right? And so as cities grow, and Fort Worth is growing so fast right now, you just got to be careful that we don't want to have everything look like Plano. We want things that's a city up north of Dallas. We want things to look like Fort Worth. And so there's a book called The Geography of Nowhere. The idea being you'd pull up to a strip mall in, any city and not know where you were because they all look the same. There's been a number of areas of the city that have become historic districts, and you'll have different guidelines depending on different cities. When I was up in North Bennett Street, Boston, they were actually determining the kind of colors that you could paint the house. But essentially, a majority of the neighborhood has to come together. There was a neighborhood over here, Mistletoe, that a house was torn down. everybody freaked out. It was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna start losing these houses, because this was probably 20 years ago. We saw what was happening to Highland Park and University Park over in Dallas. All those great historic houses were being torn down and new modern houses were being put up, and the character of those neighborhoods was being diminished. We didn't want that. So a number of the neighbors got together and voted to have it become an historic district. It ended up becoming a big fight, and it ended up becoming really ugly. And so you can have things like Fairmount coming together. They needed to preserve it. They needed to restore it. They didn't want cheap flippers coming in, and they were able to designate that neighborhood as, historic and put those guidelines in place. There's a few things, right, that as a landmarks commissioner and as a guy who loves historic houses, that you need to remember and you need to think about as you're owning your old house and thinking about it. One is, don't change your windows, okay? So the changing your windows thing is something I've got a number of videos about. You can come see it. But majority of your energy loss does not go out your windows, it goes out walls and ceilings. There's much better use of your money to insulate your walls, insulate your ceiling, insulate your attic than it is to replace windows. $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 versus $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So by a factor of 10, probably you can insulate, make your house more energy efficient by doing that, as opposed to changing out your windows. Don't change your windows. I could have a whole video on that. I do have a whole video on that. You need to check it out. Number two, insulation. I have a whole video on insulation too, because how to think about insulation. On an historic house, don't foam your walls, okay? Don't foam your houses, because what's happening is you will trap water, okay? My build show buddies get mad at me for saying this, but I think the houses should breathe. And they're like, houses shouldn't breathe. I think houses should breathe, okay? What that really means is that houses need to dry out, okay? That if it gets wet, it needs to dry. And when you put foam in your walls, you are trapping water in there. And the reason mold and stuff is happening is because our houses aren't allowed to breathe and dry out. And so that's why foam's such a terrible product, and why I recommend rock wool or mineral wool or cellulose or some of these other things, because they can actually dry out if they get wet. So when you think about insulation, I really like cellulose, because cellulose can be blown in, okay, to wall cavities and things like that. I like rock wool. You can lay that down in your attic. You put that wall, if you're doing a remodel in your house and you open up a wall cavity, you can actually put rock wool in there. So I've got another video on that. You can check it out. But really thinking about insulation and smartly applying insulation to your house. Don't use foam. You remember one thing, right? Don't use foam. 3, there's a narrative and a story to your house. Just like I told you the stories about the cattle and everything else, there is a narrative to your house. Why it was built, why it looks the way it does, and that historical style that we call it. I have another video that there's no houses after 1970 that have a style except like McMansions or something. And so when you have a very specific architectural style, you have clues for the kind of moldings you put in, the kind of hardware you put in, the kind of fireplace you put in. There is a story and a narrative that is communicated that adds more value. And it drives me crazy when flippers come along and they rip out all the old historic stuff, the moldings, the mantles, the cabinets, the doors, the hardware, and they put all new things in there as if that's going to make it better. And what they've done is they stripped out the character of the house. It no longer has the same charm, and it no longer has the same story. It's going to cost more money to go back in and make it right. So think about those narratives. Think about that story. When I'm consulting with people, a lot of the times I'm telling them, hey, remember your narrative. What does that mean about tile? Tile probably should be a hex tile. What does that mean about moldings? Probably flat moldings, maybe even stain grade moldings. What does that mean about cabinets, right? All the different things that are design clues that you walk into those old houses, you go, oh, I love it in here. Oh, that's so charming. That's so neat. Don't get rid of those things, and don't think that new's better. I heard a new word the other day. It's called modern chauvinism. And that is that idea that whatever's new is better, right? And so we can get all trapped into that. I do that with phones, right? It's a new phone, better camera. But when you think about architecture, when you think about a historic house, new isn't necessarily better. And I would argue that the working man houses that were built in Fairmount are 100 times better than a new snout-nosed working man house today. There are opportunities, okay, to still do things. For instance, in an historic district, you can still build a new house. Now, you're building it according to a guideline. And that guideline is very similar to the narrative I was talking about. The guidelines means that the size of the house, the type of windows, the size of the windows. I talk about narrative, they talk about guidelines, but what they're trying to do is new houses that go into an historic neighborhood need to fit the neighborhood. They don't need to be exact copies, right? But they do need to have the same story, right? So that you're driving up the street and you don't see a McMansion there. You see something that fits into the neighborhood, that's sensitive to the neighborhood. So that's going to drive things like windows and things like that. I really like wood windows because I think they have a depth and everything else going on with them. Typically when we're working on historic houses, we don't need to put insulated glass in there because of the historic guidelines. And so there are things that are rules and are opportunities for you to build better and you to, work in those things. But those same guidelines ought to be clues and tips for you as you work and restore your houses, because those things are all meant to make sure the story is consistent in those neighborhoods and that you don't have big, ugly, sore thumbs sticking up in places they shouldn't be. We want this character and this narrative and this story that communicates Fort Worth. That's what that great Fairmount district does, the working man's area for that growing industry that was going on in Fort Worth. So that's why we do it. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.